trees are everywhere in the media now around COP26. Forestry or trees are being praised for their climate change mitigation potential, but there's also a lot of criticism. However, when people think of trees and climate change, they mostly think of native woodland restoration. Even Pete, when he mentioned forestry, I saw that he said native woodland creation. And it's great because we've just entered the UN decade of ecosystem restoration, and reforestation of forests for conservation is of course part of that. However, as you've seen, I work for the Confederation of Forest Industries, which is already a quite scary word. And I would like to raise a bit of awareness of the climate potential of productive forestry and timber, which exists. So, oops, okay. So first of all, where are we at the moment? So I just recently saw in the news that the UK is currently on its path to only meet a quarter of its climate targets. We're aiming to reduce our emissions by 78%, which is a very ambitious target. And it's always good to see that the EU is also off track by 20 years. I think that's always quite nice for Brits to see that. And we see that little progress has been made in farming, as the Green Alliance reports. And forestry and timber is a relevant industry for quite a few of the government priorities, not only capturing carbon from growing trees, but also it's relevant for replacing high carbon materials and even for the heat and building strategy. And I just got a press release from the Woodland Trust today saying that there is a huge rise in cheap tree imports, and that puts the UK's tree planting targets even more at risk. All right, so before I start, just a brief summary of why forestry and timber can be part of the solution. So I need to move the videos away to see my slides. First of all, and I believe that even the IPCC has said that tree planting, if it's done correctly, has been considered a low cost and quite ready to use climate mitigation action. And the nice thing about forests is we don't only capture carbon, but there's other ecosystem services as well. The organization I work for, although it's the private sector, we really follow that right tree in the right place approach. Even those who believe are profit driven, they do these days have that modern forestry approach that kind of underpins what they do. So as I said, I'm going to talk more about how timber replaces more carbon intensive materials. And what is sad to see is that we currently import 80% of our timber. Only China, I think, is the first net importer, we're the second. And as you can imagine, that's not great for the future. We don't want to rely so much on imports because that comes with a climate impact as well. So the Forestry Commission has just released their statistics. We have an overall woodland area cover of just over 13%. And you can see here that this is an overview of European countries, which is down here. Even Belgium has more forests than we do. And the European Union average is 39%. Finland has 66%. Scotland is actually increasing their woodland cover. It's 19% now, but England is not doing so well in Northern Ireland. And actually the planting targets, England is really behind on their planting targets, where Scotland is quite on track. And you can see here the breakdown between broadleaves and conifers. Conifers are usually more the trees that are being used for timber. Broadleaves some, but those are mostly not felled, especially in England in this type of forest. Okay, so what's worrying is that it's not only that we're not increasing our woodland cover, but the carbon sequestration from our forest is projected to fall. And we can see here around from 2035, it's going to fall. This coincides with a projected fall in timber supply from our forests. And that's not great, right? So the question a lot of people ask me, because when I work with the general public, is should we not just grow as many trees as possible wherever we can and leave them to grow and capture carbon forever? Because of course, people don't want trees to be felled. That's not entirely true, because the most important thing about forestry, and that's why I actually went into that sector, is that it really shows how sustainable land use is built on the three pillars of people, economy, and environment. And these circles here show a forest's ecosystem services. So we need all of them. And that's why what we say is we need a mosaic of different forest types in our country and globally, or sustainably managed multi-purpose forests, right? And this is what modern forestry aims to do. So for example, if we said, okay, we're only going to campaign for conservation forests, that would be really great, because you would have a lot of, I don't know where I have it here, habitat creation for biodiversity. You would create more semi-natural forests. You would also have some carbon capture, some flood control. But then, for example, you wouldn't have any timber. If you neglect this aspect, you will have environmental, economic, and social impacts further down the line. And so everything is interlinked, and we need to have a balance. Okay, and this is an example from the New Generation Plantations campaign by the WWF. And they clearly say that growing wood in sustainable productive forests can reduce deforestation elsewhere. So some forests in the right place should actually produce timber. And they say here that plantations make up a relatively small part of the global forest cover, but provide a third of commercial timber. It's a bit like in farming. It's kind of land sparing almost. If you find the right place to put your plantations there, you manage them sustainably, you avoid deforestation and leakage of the problem elsewhere. And deforestation and degradation is a serious problem and causes 20% of emissions. Right, so this is one for Pete. So I saw Pete's slides before and I thought I need to have one of these slides as well. So Pete, if you want to challenge me, there is in the sources, there is the paper which was published by Elid Forster and her colleagues from Bangor University this July. And I can't explain it in detail, but the main point here is we've actually commissioned a similar study to this, because people often think that native woodlands and conservation forests that are perceived to be as nice, they're better for climate change mitigation than timber plantations. And so Elid looked at this in detail and actually has challenged that myth. So what we see here is, and now I think I need my notes now. What we see here is this chart shows the net cumulative CO2 impact of a single planting of new forest that was established in 2020. And that shows the result, the carbon balance 100 years later. Okay, so what we're comparing here is, on the one hand, commercial forests. And commercial forests, we have two types. We have one where the wood is used in the best way according to the cascade of wood use. So we use it for the high quality timber first, then for panel board, and only at the very end, we burn it as bioenergy. Then here we have an example of a forest that's considered to be bad. So we have a commercial forests where we just use the timber for burning it. And that's supposed to be the forest that's not great for the climate. And then here we have conservation forests that are not harvested. We have 100% broadleafed, one half-half, and one only conifers. None of these are being harvested. So what we see here, the further down this bar goes, the more carbon is, the better, let's say, the forest is for climate storage. Let's say that the more carbon is captured. So what we see here is surprising, because interestingly, the forest we thought was best is actually not doing that much, because often the broadleaf forests aren't particularly managed for carbon capture. They're great for biodiversity, but they're not doing that well for carbon capture. Mainly it's because of this choice of species. Conifers grow more quickly and also probably are more densely planted. And then here what we see, interestingly, is although they're harvested, you can see that the green bit here is equivalent to this year. But because it's harvested, we have the effect of replacing other materials. So we harvest the wood and we replace cement, for example, right? So this part here is the avoided emissions. And you can see here that it says core and FA. So this is when we have two different scenarios of decarbonization. So if we have a core scenario of decarbonization, then the impact of replacing cement with wood is greater than in a scenario of further ambitions. As I said, if you want to know more about this, the paper with all the explanation is on the last slide. Okay, so her key findings were that first and foremost, productive forestry is actually a robust climate change mitigation solution. Second, the most important factor here is actually species choice, right? And it's not as important if harvesting is carried out or not, because that's kind of offset then by the fact that if we harvest, we get these avoided emissions. Yeah. So when we say avoided emissions, it means basically mainly in the construction sector. There is now a big trend towards replacing brick, concrete, and steel by timber, especially in the public sector, but we still need to do much more. Then there is the emerging bioeconomy. So in the EU, for example, a lot of plastics have been banned, and we're now looking at materials from farming and forestry to replace that, which comes with a lot of impact as well, and even fossil fuels. So this would be the case of bioenergy. And each cubic meter of wood grown by trees holds 0.9 tons of CO2 sequestered from the atmosphere. This here is the cascade of wood use, which just shows how in an efficient scenario we would use our wood. And the industry is obviously aiming to do that. So the market actually is making us often burn more wood for bioenergy than we actually should. But the ideal would be also, as part of a circular economy, to use it for long-term products first. So I encourage you, if these slides are shared, or I can put it in the chat, to watch this video. It's really, really nice. And it shows clearly the difference between using conventional materials here in construction, but it could also be for the bioeconomy, versus carbon storing materials, which could be wood, but also farm-based materials such as straw or hemp. So you can see here that when we build something, for example, from steel, we also have to get the steel from somewhere. But as we do that, as the steel is produced, we emit carbon, right? And then we also emit carbon in manufacturing, transportation, and construction. Then we're at this level here. Red means we have emitted, we haven't stored. And then also we get emissions from landfill. Now, if we use, in this case, wood in construction, what happens is, yes, totally, we still have emissions from harvest, manufacturing, transportation, and construction, but we start at a negative level because of the carbon that is stored in the trees. So from that stored carbon, we take away a bit, towards zero, from negative to zero. We're still at zero. And then once the building has to be destroyed, we then have several options. The best ones, reuse and recycle, repurpose, they still keep us in the negative area. But even in the worst case scenario, we're still much better off than using the traditional materials. So having said all that, timber in the UK is actually in short supply. There has been a 3% decrease in UK roundwood going to mills. This is a bit, I'll explain later why that is. And also we have seen that there are projections from the Forestry Commission showing that there will be a shortage of timber supply from about 2035 or 2040 for about 20 years. And that's not great, also considering that the bioeconomy is on the rise, timber in construction is being promoted, and there is Brexit. So we will need more timber, and it has to come from somewhere. But we're on a long path. We're on a path of losing productive forests. I'm just going to... So in Scotland, things are looking good for productive forestry. But in England, what's happening is the Forestry Commission shows figures of broadleaf planting, restocking, and conifer restocking. What they don't say is that some of the broadleaf restocking is on ground that was formerly productive forestry, conifers, which means they're repurposing land from productive forestry to conservation forestry. And it's nice, it's good to have conservation forestry, don't get me wrong, but it means that effectively in England and in Wales, we're losing productive forests. And considering the demand we have, and also the context of the climate change mitigation potential, that's not ideal. Yeah. So what's the way forward for us? So my recommendations here would be, first of all, we need to increase our tree planting in the UK using this right tree in the right place approach. Scotland is doing well, but England and Wales really, really need to do something about that. We want well-designed large-scale projects that deliver for timber, biodiversity, and people. We don't want disconnected conservation forestry that isn't actually well managed, which often happens. So we want really something coherent and consistent. We would suggest that big forestry investors that often push for big planting schemes work together with the big lobbies such as the Woodland Trust to make this happen. And within the productive forestry sector, we have looked at where do we have potential to increase efficiency in resource use. We think there's still potential to use the resources from harvesting better. what are we leaving on the ground? How much do we need for organic matter recovery and so forth? And also, we are pretty sure that what we need to do is we need to channel more wood fiber into long-term products to keep the carbon locked up. For example, from wood chip, rather than burning it, we should create new insulation materials and have these materials remain in buildings for a long time and keep that carbon locked up. And here you've got all the resources. They don't come from the Confederation of Forestry, most of them.